The autumn wind swept across the Dakota plains like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and distant snow. The sun hung low in the October sky, casting long shadows across the frontier town of Bitter Creek, where dust devils danced between weathered buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. In the distance, the Badlands rose like ancient sentinels, their red rock faces carved by centuries of wind and rain into shapes that resembled the faces of forgotten gods. The town buzzed with unusual activity this particular afternoon. Women hurried about in their best calico dresses, their bonnets freshly starched despite the ever-present dust. Men gathered in small groups outside the saloon, passing around flasks of whiskey and speaking in low, excited tones. The annual bride choosing was set to begin at sunset, and the whole town had turned out for the spectacle. Chase Whitehawk, known to his people as Chaska, rode into town as the preparations reached their peak. His arrival caused a ripple of whispers to spread through the gathered crowd. He sat tall on his paint horse, a man caught between two worlds, wearing a mixture of traditional Lakota clothing and the practical garments of a frontier scout. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, held back by a leather band adorned with a single eagle feather. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw spoke of battles fought and survived, while his eyes, dark as winter nights, held the weight of losses that went deeper than flesh. He had been gone for 3 moons, tracking rustlers through the Badlands for the territorial marshal. The job paid well enough, but it wasn't the money that drove him. It was the need to keep moving, to outrun the ghosts that haunted his dreams. His younger brother's face still visited him in the quiet hours before dawn, frozen in that last moment of surprise as the cavalry bullet found its mark. Chase dismounted at the livery stable, his movements fluid despite the weariness that pulled at his bones. Old Samuel, the stable keeper, took the reins without meeting his eyes, even here, on the edge of civilization where mixed bloods and outcasts gathered. Chase's full Lakota heritage marked him as other. "Big doin's tonight," Samuel muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Every unmarried gal from here to Fort Pierre lined up for the choosing. You might want to take a look-see." Chase said nothing, merely nodded as he unsaddled his horse. He had no interest in the white man's customs, especially not this one that reminded him too much of a livestock auction. But as he worked, he became aware of the preparations taking place in the town square. Tables had been set up, laden with pies and preserves, the handiwork of hopeful young women advertising their domestic skills. Lanterns were being strung between posts, ready to cast their golden light when darkness fell. The tradition had started 5 years ago, when the town council decided that the shortage of wives was hampering the territory's growth. Once a year, families would present their unmarried daughters, and bachelor men could make their choice. It was considered more civilized than the mail-order bride system, though Chase saw little difference between the two. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, the women began to take their places. They formed a line along the wooden platform that usually served for town meetings and occasional hangings. Most were young, their faces bright with nervous excitement or barely concealed desperation. They wore their finest dresses, some store-bought from back east, others lovingly sewn by lamplight over long winter evenings. At the end of the line, almost hidden in the growing shadows, stood a woman who seemed to wish she could disappear entirely. Margaret Maggie Sullivan, once Margaret Donovan, kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her black widow's dress a stark contrast to the colorful fabrics surrounding her. At 24, she was older than most of the others, and her presence in the line caused more than a few disapproving glances and whispered comments. "Don't know why she bothers." "Mrs. Henderson hissed to her companion. "Everyone knows she's cursed. Poor Tom Donovan wasn't cold in the ground before she was back living under her father's roof." "I heard she bewitched him," another woman added, her voice carrying despite her attempt at discretion. "He was healthy as a horse until he married her, 6 months later, dead in that terrible storm." Maggie heard every word. They weren't trying particularly hard to be quiet, but she kept her chin up, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her father had given her no choice. Either submit to the choosing or find somewhere else to live. And in a frontier town, a woman alone had few options. None of them good. The bachelor men began to gather, some swaggering with confidence, others shuffling their feet nervously. They were a varied lot. Farmers with soil still under their fingernails, miners bearing the permanent squint of those who spent their days in darkness, cowboys who smelled of leather and horses, and townsmen in their Sunday best. Chase had intended to pass by the spectacle entirely, but something, curiosity perhaps, or simply the perverse desire to witness the depths of human folly, drew him to the edge of the crowd. He stood apart, his presence causing a small circle of space to form around him as people instinctively moved away. Mayor Hutchins, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and a gold watch chain straining across his vest, stepped forward to begin the proceedings. "Gentlemen," he boomed, "welcome to Bitter Creek's 5th annual bride choosing. The rules are simple. Each man may approach the line and make his selection. The lady has the right of refusal, of course, but," he chuckled, and several men joined him. "I don't expect we'll see much of that tonight." One by one, the men approached the line. Young Robert Carlson, heir to the largest ranch in the county, chose pretty Sarah Mills, who blushed becomingly and accepted with a giggle. The matches came quickly after that, farmers choosing farmers' daughters, merchants selecting women who looked like they could run a household and help with the books. As the choosing continued, Maggie remained standing at the end of the line, her isolation becoming more pronounced as women on either side of her were selected. Some men walked the entire length of the platform, their eyes sliding past her as if she were invisible. Others paused, considered, then moved on when they remembered the whispers, the stories, the warnings. Chase watched it all with growing disgust, the casual cruelty of it, the way hope died in Maggie's eyes with each rejection, even as she struggled to maintain her dignity. He recognized something in her stance, the way she held herself against the world's judgment. It was the same way he stood when facing down those who saw only his Lakota blood and nothing of the man beneath. The crowd was thinning now, the chosen couples moving off to discuss their futures with families. Only a handful of women remained on the platform, and the men who were left were those whose prospects were as dim as the women they faced. That's when Chase moved. His stride was unhurried but purposeful, and the crowd parted before him like grass before the wind. Conversations died mid-sentence. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Men's hands drifted toward the guns they weren't wearing. This was supposed to be a civilized gathering. After all, Chase walked past the first woman in the remaining line without a glance, past the second, who actually leaned toward him hopefully despite her mother's frantic head shaking, past the third and fourth, his boots making hollow sounds on the wooden platform. He stopped in front of Maggie. For the first time all evening, she looked up, and their eyes met. Hers were green as spring grass, wide with shock and something else, a flicker of defiance that hadn't quite been extinguished by the evening's humiliations. Chase's voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the square. The Lakota rider ignored every bride in line, then chose the woman no one else would touch. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers erupted into a roar. Women gasped, men cursed. The mayor sputtered, his face turning the color of a ripe tomato. "Now see here," Hutchins blustered. "This is highly irregular. The choosing is meant for bachelors seeking wives." Chase interrupted, his tone mild but his eyes hard. "I qualify on both counts, unless there's a rule I'm not aware of." The mayor's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. There was no such rule, of course. It had never occurred to anyone that it might be necessary. Maggie stared at Chase, her mind racing. She had seen him around town occasionally, always alone, always watchful. She knew his reputation, an excellent tracker, a dangerous man when crossed, but fair in his dealings. She also knew what choosing him would mean. If being a widow had made her an outcast, being an Indian's woman would place her beyond the pale entirely. "Miss Sullivan," Chase said, and his use of her maiden name was not lost on her. "Will you accept?" The crowd held its breath. This was the moment where she could refuse, where she could cling to the tattered remnants of her place in white society. But Maggie looked into Chase's eyes and saw something there. Not pity, not charity, but recognition. He knew what it was to be judged and found wanting by those who had never bothered to look deeper. "I accept," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. The uproar was immediate. Women pulled their children close as if Maggie's choice might be contagious. Men muttered darkly about the natural order of things. But Chase had already stepped forward, offering his arm with a courtesy that would have done credit to any Eastern gentleman. As they walked through the crowd together, Maggie kept her eyes straight ahead, but she was acutely aware of every hostile glance, every muttered curse. Beside her, Chase moved with the easy confidence of a man who had faced worse than social disapproval. "Why?" she asked when they had cleared the worst of the crowd. Chase was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I know what it is to stand alone while others judge. And because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because something in your eyes reminded me that not all strength comes from never being broken. Sometimes it comes from being broken and choosing to stand anyway." They walked on into the gathering darkness, two outcasts who had found each other at civilization's edge, while behind them the good people of Bitter Creek buzzed with scandal and prophecies of doom. The wagon rolled away from Bitter Creek as the last light faded from the sky, leaving only the cold stars to witness their departure. Maggie sat beside Chase on the hard wooden seat, her few possessions hastily packed in a worn carpet bag, resting at her feet. Neither spoke as the lights of the town grew smaller behind them, swallowed by the vast darkness of the plains. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people taking measure of the momentous step they had just taken. Maggie pulled her shawl tighter against the night wind, stealing glances at the man beside her. In the moonlight, his profile was sharp and watchful, his hands steady on the reins despite the rough trail. "My place is a half-day's ride," Chase finally said, his voice barely audible above the creak of wagon wheels and the distant howl of coyotes. "We'll camp tonight by Soldier Creek." Maggie nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. She had 1,000 questions crowding her throat, but none seemed appropriate. Why had he chosen her? What did he expect? What kind of life was she riding toward? Instead, she asked, "Do you have neighbors?" "None close enough to bother with." He paused, then added, "That troubles you?" "No," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. In truth, the isolation frightened her less than the thought of facing more judgment, more whispers, more turned backs. They made camp in a grove of cottonwoods by the creek, their leaves rustling like whispered secrets in the night breeze. Chase worked with practiced efficiency, unhitching the horses, gathering wood, starting a fire. Maggie tried to help, but her hands shook as she unpacked the few provisions they'd stopped to buy at Muller's store, the old German shopkeeper being one of the few who'd still serve them, though his wife had watched from behind the curtain with disapproving eyes. "Sit," Chase said, not unkindly, when she dropped the coffee pot for the second time. "You've had a long day." She sank onto a fallen log near the fire, watching as he prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. The domesticity of the scene struck her as almost absurd. Here she was, in the middle of nowhere with a man she barely knew, a man whose choice of her had severed whatever thin threads still connected her to respectable society. "Are you regretting it already?" Chase asked, handing her a tin plate. The directness of the question startled her. "Are you?" He considered this as he settled across the fire from her. "I don't make decisions lightly. When I do, I don't waste time on regret." They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. Above, an owl called, and somewhere in the darkness, something small screamed as it met its end. The sounds of the night pressed in around their small circle of light, reminding Maggie how far she was from the relative safety of town. "You're frightened," Chase observed. "Yes," she admitted. There seemed no point in pretense. "Of me?" She thought about it, really considered the question. "No, not of you. Of everything else." of not knowing what comes next, of—" She stopped, unable to articulate the bone-deep fear that had lived in her since the night Tom died, the fear that she really was cursed, that she carried death with her like a disease. "We all carry our dead," Chase said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "The trick is not letting them drag us down with them." After they'd eaten, he showed her how to bank the fire for the night and strung a rope between two trees. He threw a blanket over it, creating a simple privacy screen. "Your side," he said, gesturing to one half of their camp. "Mine," indicating the other. The consideration surprised and touched her as she prepared for sleep, rolling out the blankets he'd given her. She could hear him moving about on his side of the camp, checking on the horses, securing their supplies. Normal sounds, everyday sounds, but they helped ease the knot of tension in her chest. Still, sleep eluded her. She lay staring up at the stars through the cottonwood branches, thinking about the turn her life had taken. This morning she had woken in her childhood bed, in the room she'd returned to after Tom's death, her father's disapproval a constant weight. Tonight she lay on hard ground, bound to a man she didn't know, with no idea what tomorrow would bring. "Can't sleep," Chase's voice came from the darkness. "No." She heard him shift, probably sitting up against a tree. "Want to know what you've gotten yourself into?" "Yes," she whispered. "I have a small ranch, nothing fancy, a cabin, a barn, some corrals. I raise horses, do some trading, take tracking jobs when they come. It's hard work, lonely work. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles east, and they don't take kindly to Indians. Town is a day's ride when the weather's good, which it often isn't. Winter," he paused. "Winter can be brutal. And you chose to take a wife because—" She felt rather than saw his shrug. "A man gets tired of talking to horses, and maybe—" His voice dropped. "Maybe I saw something of myself in you today. Someone who's learned to stand straight while the world tries to break them." Maggie turned this over in her mind. "Your brother," she said carefully. "Samuel mentioned you'd lost family." The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Daniel, he was 19, full of fire and dreams of bringing our people into the new world. He believed the promises, thought if we proved ourselves useful, proved ourselves civilized, we'd be accepted." A bitter laugh. "He was scouting for the army when a green lieutenant got nervous and gave the order to fire. They said it was a mistake," said Daniel, looked threatening in the dust and confusion. "I'm sorry. 3 years ago, our parents were already gone. Fever took them the winter before, so now it's just me, caught between the world I was born to and the world I have to live in." Maggie understood that feeling too well. "The night Tom died," she found herself saying, "there was a storm, not just rain, hail the size of fists, wind that could knock a grown man down. He went to check on the horses. I begged him to wait, but he laughed, said he'd faced worse. The barn door, the wind caught it, slammed it into him, broke his skull." She swallowed hard. "His mother found him the next morning, said I should have gone instead, that I'd sent him out there, said I was a curse, that I'd killed him sure as if I'd swung that door myself. People need someone to blame when loss comes." Chase said, "Makes them feel like the world has rules, like bad things happen for reasons. Truth is, sometimes storms just come." They talked through the night, trading stories in the darkness. He told her about learning to track from his grandfather, about the first time he'd seen a white settlement and thought the buildings looked like scabs on the earth. She told him about growing up on her father's failing farm, about meeting Tom at a harvest dance and thinking she'd found her escape. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky pink and gold, Maggie realized the fear had loosened its grip. She was still uncertain, still worried about what lay ahead, but something had shifted in those dark hours of shared words. They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, the morning air crisp with the promise of autumn's end. As they continued their journey, the landscape began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills dotted with pine and juniper. Red rock formations rose from the earth like ancient ruins, and eagles circled overhead on invisible currents. "It's beautiful," Maggie breathed as they crested a hill and the land spread out before them in waves of gold and green and red. "Beautiful and harsh," Chase agreed. "This land doesn't forgive mistakes, but if you respect it, learn its ways, it will provide." They stopped at midday by a stream that cut through a narrow canyon. While the horses drank, Chase showed her how to read the signs in the mud: deer tracks, raccoon prints, the slither mark of a snake. He was a patient teacher, and Maggie found herself relaxing in his presence. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel grounded despite the uncertainty of her situation. As afternoon wore on, they began to see signs of habitation: fence posts, a distant line of smoke, cattle grazing on a far hillside. Chase's expression grew more guarded, and Maggie understood. They were entering the edges of settled land again, where their presence together would draw stares and speculation. Sure enough, as they passed a small homestead, a woman hanging laundry stopped to gawk. 2 children playing in the yard ran inside, probably to fetch their father. Maggie kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the weight of their judgment. "Let them look," Chase said quietly. "Their opinions can't hurt us unless we let them." But Maggie noticed he urged the horses to a faster pace, and she was grateful when the homestead fell behind them. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Chase pointed ahead. "There," he said. "Home." Maggie looked and saw a small valley tucked between 2 hills. A cabin sat near a stream, its logs weathered silver gray. A barn and several corrals stood nearby, and she could see horses grazing in a meadow beyond. Smoke rose from the cabin's chimney, which puzzled her until Chase explained. "Old Pete, he's a drifter I let stay in the barn sometimes in exchange for looking after things when I'm gone. He'll be moving on now that I'm back." As they descended into the valley, Maggie felt a complex mix of emotions: relief at journey's end, apprehension about what came next, and something else, a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something here in this isolated valley with this complicated man who had chosen her when no one else would. The cabin was small but solidly built, with real glass windows and a covered porch facing east to catch the morning sun. Inside, it was sparse but clean: a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, and a single bedroom. Chase showed her around with an awkwardness that would have been amusing under other circumstances. "I'll sleep in the barn until," he gestured vaguely, "until we figure things out." Maggie nodded, grateful again for his consideration. She was his wife in the eyes of the law now. They'd stopped at the courthouse before leaving town to make it official, but they were still strangers in all the ways that mattered. That night, alone in the cabin while Chase bedded down in the barn, Maggie stood at the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and others answered. The sound should have frightened her, but instead she found it oddly comforting. Here, at the edge of the world, maybe 2 broken people could find a way to build something whole. The first frost came 3 days after Maggie's arrival, silvering the grass and rimming the water trough with ice. She woke to find Chase already at work, breaking the ice so the horses could drink. From the kitchen window, she watched him move among the animals with a gentle confidence that contrasted sharply with his usual guarded demeanor around people. "Coffee's ready," she called from the porch, her breath misting in the cold air. He looked up, surprised. In the days since her arrival, they'd maintained a polite distance, dancing around each other like wary cats. He slept in the barn, she in the cabin. They shared meals but little else, each uncertain how to bridge the gap between strangers and whatever they were meant to become. "Thank you," he said, climbing the porch steps, his hands wrapped around the hot mug gratefully. "You're up early." "Farm habits die hard," she replied. "What needs doing today?" He studied her over the rim of his cup. She'd traded her widow's weeds for a practical work dress and apron, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. "Can you ride?" It's been a while. "The horses need moving to the winter pasture. Easier with 2. And so began Maggie's education in frontier ranching. Chase selected a gentle mare for her, a bay named Buttercup with patient eyes and a steady disposition. As he adjusted the stirrups, his hands brushed her ankle, and they both froze at the contact. It was the first time he'd touched her since helping her down from the wagon that first night. "Sorry," he muttered, stepping back. "It's fine," Maggie said quickly, though her cheeks burned. "We're married, after all." The words hung between them, highlighting the strange nature of their arrangement. Married in law, but not in truth, bound together by desperation and defiance rather than affection. They spent the morning moving the small herd, about 20 horses in all, to a sheltered valley where the grass was still good and the hills would block the worst of the winter wind. Chase rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, while Maggie struggled to remember lessons from her girlhood. But she was determined not to be a burden, and by midday, she'd found her seat again. "You're doing well," Chase observed as they paused to rest the horses by a stream. "I had a good teacher, once," Maggie said, thinking of her father in better days, before drought and debt had broken his spirit. "He used to say riding was like dancing, all about finding the rhythm. Smart man." Chase dismounted and helped her down, his hand strong and steady at her waist. This time, neither of them pulled away quite so quickly. As the days passed, they fell into a routine. Mornings were for chores, feeding animals, collecting eggs from the few chickens, hauling water. Afternoons, Chase taught her the skills she'd need to survive: how to shoot his old Henry rifle, how to read weather signs, how to preserve meat for the long winter ahead. Evenings found them by the fire, Chase working leather while Maggie mended clothes or read from the few books he owned. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Maggie discovered Chase's hidden talent. She'd been struggling with a harness repair when he gently took it from her hands. "Here," he said, "let me show you." His fingers moved with surprising delicacy, weaving the leather strips into an intricate pattern, not just functional, but beautiful. "Where did you learn that?" she asked, amazed. A shadow crossed his face. "My mother, she was known among our people for her quill work and beading. When I was young, before," he paused, "before things changed, she taught me, said a man should know how to create beauty, not just destroy." "She was right," Maggie said softly. "It's beautiful." He handed the repaired harness back to her. Useful skill out here. Leather goods bring good trade. But Maggie had seen the way his eyes softened when he spoke of his mother, the grief that still lingered there. She was learning to read him, this quiet man who had chosen her. He carried his losses like scars, visible only when the light hit just right. The next morning brought their first real test as partners. One of the mares, a beautiful paint chase called Storm Dancer, had gotten tangled in some old barbed wire at the far edge of the property. By the time they found her, her legs were badly cut, and she was wild with pain and fear. "Hold her head," Chase instructed, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Talk to her. Keep her still while I work." Maggie approached carefully, crooning soft words as her father had taught her. The mare's eyes rolled white with terror, but something in Maggie's voice seemed to reach her. As Chase worked to cut away the wire, Maggie kept up a steady stream of soothing nonsense, her hands gentle but firm on the halter. "That's it," Chase murmured, whether to her or the horse. She wasn't sure. Almost done. When the wire finally fell away, the damage was worse than they'd feared. Deep gashes ran down both front legs, and blood flowed freely. "Will she survive?" Maggie asked. "Maybe, if we can keep the wounds clean, prevent infection." He was already heading for the barn. "Bring her slow. I'll get supplies." They worked together through the afternoon, cleaning and dressing the wounds. Chase showed Maggie how to make a poultice from plants he gathered, yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain. His knowledge was a mixture of traditional Lakota medicine and practical frontier veterinary care. "She's strong," he said as they finally stepped back to admire their handiwork. Storm Dancer stood quietly now, the wildness gone from her eyes. "And she trusts you." "That's half the battle." "She trusts us," Maggie corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." Something shifted in his expression. "No," he said quietly. "We did it together." That night, he didn't immediately retreat to the barn after dinner. Instead, he lingered by the fire, and Maggie found herself telling him about her mother, dead when she was 12. "She was the strongest woman I knew," Maggie said, staring into the flames. "Came from good family back east, scandalized them all by marrying a farmer. She could play piano like an angel, but she learned to birth calves and mend fences. Used to say life was about adapting, about becoming what you needed to be. She sounds wise. She was, I think—" Maggie hesitated. "I think she would have liked you. She always said the measure of a man wasn't in his birth or his possessions, but in how he treated those who couldn't help him." Chase was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My grandmother would have liked you too. She used to say the strongest trees were those that bent with the wind but didn't break." As the fire burned low, neither of them moved to end the evening. The distance between them had shrunk. Not physically, he still sat across the room, but in some indefinable way that made the cabin feel warmer. The next weeks brought the rhythm of hard work and gradual familiarity. Maggie learned to read the moods of the horses, to predict weather by the way the clouds gathered over the mountains. She discovered muscles she'd forgotten she had, fell into bed each night exhausted but somehow satisfied. More than that, she learned about Chase, how he hummed tunelessly while working leather, how his rare smiles transformed his face completely, how he could track a deer across bare rock but couldn't make biscuits to save his life. "How did you survive on your own?" She laughed one morning after he'd produced another batch of rock-hard lumps. He grinned, actually grinned, at her. "Mostly cornmeal mush and whatever I could trade for in town. Old Pete used to take pity on me sometimes." "Well," she said, rolling out proper dough, "I suppose I'd better earn my keep." "You already have," he said, suddenly serious. "Storm Dancer wouldn't have made it without you. You've got good hands, steady nerves. Out here, that's worth more than gold." The praise warmed her more than the kitchen fire. She'd been useful on Tom's farm, but he'd never acknowledged it, taking her labor as his due. Chase noticed everything, when she reinforced a weak fence post, when she figured out which hen was hiding her eggs, when she mended his shirts with tiny, careful stitches. One afternoon, as she worked in the garden plot behind the cabin, she looked up to find him watching her from the barn door. Their eyes met across the distance, and something electric passed between them. Then he turned away, and the moment was gone, leaving Maggie with dirt-stained hands and a racing heart. That night, the first winter storm rolled in. The temperature plummeted, and snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes. By morning, the world was transformed, white and pristine and somehow smaller. Chase appeared at the door covered in snow. "Stock's all secure," he said, stamping his feet. "But I'm thinking it might be time to move my things inside, if you're agreeable." Maggie's heart jumped, but she kept her voice steady. "There's sense in it. No point freezing in the barn when there's room inside." He moved his few possessions into the main room, setting up a bedroll by the fireplace, still maintaining distance, but the cabin felt different with him there. Fuller, more alive. That evening, as the storm raged outside, they sat closer than usual, the circle of warmth drawing them together. Chase was braiding a new lead rope, and Maggie watched his fingers work their magic. "Could you teach me?" she asked impulsively. He looked up, surprised. "If you'd like." He moved to sit beside her, the closest they'd been since that day by the stream. His hands covered hers, guiding them through the motions. She could smell leather and wood smoke, feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Like this," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. Over, under, through. Her fingers trembled, but not from the complexity of the weave. When she fumbled the pattern, he didn't pull away, just patiently guided her through it again. "I'm not usually this clumsy," she said, embarrassed by her shaking hands. "You're doing fine," he said, and something in his voice made her look up. Their faces were inches apart, his dark eyes holding hers. For a moment, The world narrowed to just this, the two of them, the warmth of shared space, the possibility hanging in the air between them. Then a log shifted in the fireplace, breaking the spell. Chase pulled back, clearing his throat. You've got the idea now. Practice, and it'll come natural. But as Maggie continued working the leather, very aware of him beside her, she thought that some things might never come naturally. Trust, perhaps, or the courage to reach for what she was beginning to want. Outside, the storm howled its fury, but inside the small cabin, two damaged souls were slowly, carefully, learning to bend toward each other like flowers seeking sun. The riders came on a gray December afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of snow. Maggie saw them first, 5 men on horseback, moving with the deliberate pace of those who meant trouble. She was in the barn, checking on Storm Dancer's healing legs, when the sound of hooves made her freeze. "Chase," she called quietly, knowing he was working in the back stall. He appeared instantly, reading the tension in her voice. One look out the barn door told him everything. "Stay here," he said, his hand moving automatically to the rifle propped against the wall. "Whatever happens, stay hidden." But Maggie had learned something about herself in these past weeks. She was tired of hiding, tired of letting others fight battles that were partly hers. "No," she said firmly. "We face this together." His eyes flashed with something, pride, fear, resignation. Before he nodded, "Then stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run." They walked out together to meet the riders. Maggie recognized 3 of them from town, Jack Holloway and his sons, Marcus and William. The other 2 were strangers, rough-looking men with the weathered faces of those who lived by violence. All 5 were armed. "Whitehawk," Jack Holloway said, not bothering with pleasantries. He was a big man who'd made his money in cattle and never let anyone forget it. "Heard you took yourself a white woman." "My wife," Chase said calmly, though Maggie could see the tension in his shoulders. "Which makes her no concern of yours." Marcus Holloway, younger and meaner than his father, spat tobacco juice near Chase's feet. "Everything in this territory's our concern when it comes to keeping things proper. Bad enough we got to tolerate your kind trading in town. But this—" His eyes raked over Maggie with such contempt that she had to fight not to step back. "This ain't natural." "What's not natural?" Chase said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is 5 armed men riding onto my property uninvited. State your business or move on." The elder Holloway leaned forward in his saddle. "Business is simple. The woman comes with us. We'll see she gets back to her people, somewhere far from here. You can go back to living with your own kind. Everybody's happy." "I'm where I choose to be," Maggie said, stepping out from behind Chase before he could stop her. "With my husband, on our land. You have no right." "You lost your rights when you took up with this savage," William Holloway interrupted. "Your poor dead husband must be rolling in his grave." The word savage hit Chase like a physical blow. Maggie saw his knuckles whiten around the rifle, but his voice remained level. "You need to leave, now!" "Or what?" One of the strangers spoke for the first time, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "You'll take on all 5 of us, for some white trash widow who couldn't do better than an Indian." It happened fast. Marcus reached for his gun. Whether to threaten or shoot, Maggie never knew. Chase's rifle swung up, not firing but ready, and Maggie, acting on instinct, stepped directly between them. "You'll have to go through me," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm not some possession to be taken or given. I'm a free woman who made her choice. And if you can't respect that, then you're the savages here." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Snow began to fall, fat flakes that settled on shoulders and hat brims. Finally, Jack Holloway spoke. "You're making a mistake, woman. This won't end well. Not for him, not for you." "Is that a threat?" Chase asked softly. "It's a promise." Marcus snarled. "This territory's got ways of dealing with those who don't know their place." "Then I guess we understand each other," Chase replied. Now get off my land before I forget my manners entirely." For a moment, violence trembled in the air like heat shimmer. Then Jack Holloway yanked his horse's head around. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." They rode away slowly, making their contempt clear in every deliberately lazy movement. Chase and Maggie stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge, neither moving even as the snow began to fall harder. "You shouldn't have stepped between us," Chase said finally. "You shouldn't have to face them alone," Maggie countered. He turned to look at her then, really look at her. Snow caught in her dark hair, and her green eyes blazed with a fierce light. "They'll be back," he said. "With more men. Probably this was just testing the waters. Then we'll be ready. Maggie," he stopped, ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You don't understand. Men like that, they don't stop. They'll burn us out, hurt you to get to me. You should go. I'll give you money. Help you get somewhere safe." "No." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare try to send me away. Not now. I'm trying to protect you." "I don't need protection," she shot back. "I need a partner. I thought that's what we were becoming." They stood facing each other in the swirling snow, both breathing hard. Then Chase did something that stunned her. He dropped the rifle and pulled her against him, his arms fierce around her. "You brave, foolish woman," he murmured into her hair. "Don't you know what you risk?" "I know what I've already lost," she said against his chest. "I won't lose this too, not to fear, not to hate." They stood there as the snow fell around them, holding each other for the first time since their strange wedding day, when they finally pulled apart. Something had changed between them. The careful distance they'd maintained had crumbled like a dam before floodwater. That night, they prepared for siege. Chase showed Maggie where he kept extra ammunition, taught her to load and fire his pistol as well as the rifle. They moved the horses into the barn, secured what supplies they could. All the while, they worked in a new kind of harmony, born of shared danger and mutual choice. "Tell me about Tom," Chase said suddenly as they were boarding up one of the windows. "You loved him?" Maggie was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I thought I did. He was handsome, charming, everything a girl was supposed to want, but looking back," she hammered another nail with perhaps more force than necessary, "he never saw me. Not really. I was just another thing to acquire, like land or cattle. Pretty enough, good breeding stock, able to work hard. When he died, I grieved, but maybe I grieved more for what I'd hoped we'd have than what we actually had. And now," she looked at him across the dim cabin, "now I'm starting to understand the difference between being chosen and being truly seen." They worked late into the night, finally collapsing by the fire, exhausted. But sleep wouldn't come. The wind howled outside, and every sound might be returning riders. "I wasn't always alone," Chase said into the darkness. "There was a woman, once, Catherine Two Moons. We were going to marry, build a life that bridged both worlds. Then the soldiers came to relocate her family. She begged me to fight, to stop them. I tried talking instead, reasoning while I was using words. They were using force. She died in the struggle. Shot by accident, they said, another mistake." Maggie reached out, found his hand in the darkness. "That's why you wouldn't shoot today." "I've seen where violence leads. But sometimes," his fingers tightened around hers, "sometimes words aren't enough. Today, when they threatened you, I wanted to kill them all. But you didn't. You kept control, gave them a chance to leave. That's strength, not weakness. You sound like my grandfather," he said, and she could hear the slight smile in his voice. "He used to say the warrior who conquers himself is greater than the one who conquers cities." They talked through the night again, but this time sitting close, hands clasped like a lifeline. Maggie told him about the months after Tom's death, the cruel whispers, the way even her own father looked at her with suspicion. Chase spoke of the years after losing his family, the loneliness that ate at him like winter wind. As dawn broke, they were still awake, still talking, still holding hands. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and new. No riders had come in the night, but they both knew this was just the beginning. "Whatever comes," Maggie said, watching the sun paint the snow-covered mountains pink and gold. "We face it together." "Together," Chase agreed, and lifted their joined hands to his lips in a gesture that made her heart skip. Over the next days, they worked to fortify their position. Chase rode to the few neighbors who might be sympathetic, warning them of trouble. Most listened politely and promised nothing, but old Samuel from the livery stable sent his grandson Bobby with supplies and news from town. "Holloways are stirring up sentiment," Bobby reported, accepting a cup of coffee gratefully, talking about the need to keep the territory pure, protect white womanhood. "But not everyone's buying it. Mrs. Muller says any woman who can make Chase Whitehawk smile must be doing something right." It was a small comfort, knowing they weren't entirely friendless. But as the days passed with no sign of the Holloways, the tension grew. Waiting, Maggie discovered, was its own kind of torture. She threw herself into work, helping Chase prepare for winter's worst. They smoked meat, patched every crack in the cabin, laid in supplies like an army preparing for siege, and somewhere in the midst of survival, they began to build something else, a partnership that went beyond mere necessity. Chase taught her to track deer through new snow, to find her direction by stars when clouds obscured the mountains. Maggie shared her mother's recipes, her father's stories, the small songs she hummed while working. They learned each other's silences, the comfortable ones and the grief-heavy ones. One evening, as Maggie struggled with a particularly stubborn piece of leatherwork, Chase covered her hands with his own, guiding them through the pattern. But this time, when the lesson was done, he didn't pull away. Instead, he turned her hands palm up, tracing the calluses there with one finger. "Soft city hands when you came," he murmured. "Now they tell a different story." "What story is that?" she asked, barely breathing. His eyes met hers, dark and intense. Strength, courage, choice. He lifted her hands to frame her face, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Beautiful." The word hung between them like a gift. Then, slowly, giving her time to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle, almost tentative, nothing like Tom's possessive claiming. This was question and answer, give and take, two souls meeting in the space between heartbeats. When they parted, Maggie's eyes were wet with tears she couldn't name. She began, but he pressed a finger to her lips. "No words," he said softly. "Not yet, just this." They sat together by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the flames dance. Outside, danger still circled like wolves. But inside, something precious and fragile bloomed, all the more beautiful for the darkness that surrounded it. The blizzard struck on the 3rd day of January with a fury that seemed personal. The wind screamed down from the mountains like a living thing, driving snow horizontal, turning the world into a white void where sky and earth became one. Maggie had seen storms before, but nothing like this savage assault that shook the cabin walls and sent snow filtering through every tiny crack. "It's going to be a long one," Chase said, peering out the window at the wall of white. "Could last days." They'd prepared as best they could, but no amount of preparation could fully ready them for nature's raw power. By the 2nd day, they were burning furniture to conserve the wood pile. By the 3rd, frost covered the inside walls despite the fire's constant heat. It was on the 4th night that Maggie fell ill. She'd been tired all day, something she attributed to the bone-deep cold that seemed to leach strength from everything. But as darkness fell, the chills began, violent shaking that no amount of blankets could stop. "Just cold," she insisted through chattering teeth. "I'll be fine." But Chase knew better. He'd seen fever before, watched it take his mother despite all the traditional remedies. His hands shook as he felt her burning forehead, the heat radiating from her skin even as she shivered. "We need to bring the fever down," he said, trying to keep the fear from his voice. The next hours blurred into a nightmare of alternating heat and cold. Maggie thrashed in delirium, calling for her mother, for Tom, crying out words that made no sense. Chase never left her side, cooling her fever with snow-dampened cloths, forcing sips of willow bark tea between her cracked lips. "Please," he found himself whispering to whatever powers might listen. Not her, not now. In her fevered dreams, Maggie walked through landscapes of memory and fear. She was a child again, watching her mother waste away despite all their prayers. She stood in the doorway of a barn, watching Tom's body crumple in slow motion while his mother's accusations rang in her ears. She saw Chase standing alone on an endless plain, calling her name as she drifted further and further away. "No," she mumbled, fighting toward consciousness. "Won't leave. Promised. Together." "I'm here," Chase said, catching her flailing hand. "I'm right here. Fight. Maggie, come back to me." The storm raged for 2 more days. Chase barely slept, maintaining his vigil, talking to her constantly, stories of his childhood, Lakota legends his grandmother told, plans for spring, anything to give her an anchor to this world. When the willow bark ran out, he crushed pine needles for tea, remembered his mother making medicine from things the whites overlooked. On the 7th morning, Maggie's fever broke. She opened clear eyes to find Chase slumped beside the bed, his hand still clasping hers, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "You look terrible," she whispered. His eyes flew open, and the relief that washed over his features made her heart clench. "You're back," he said roughly. "Thank the spirits, you're back." She tried to sit up, gasped at how weak she felt. "The storm." "Passing, like you, too stubborn to give up." His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "You scared me, woman, more than any blizzard could. How long?" 3 days of fever, 3 very long days." She studied his face, seeing new lines carved by worry and sleeplessness. "You stayed with me. Where else would I be?" The simple question held volumes. "You're my wife." But it was more than duty in his eyes, more than obligation in his touch. Maggie saw what he couldn't yet say aloud, felt it in the tender way he helped her sip water, the careful hands that changed her sweat-soaked nightgown. Recovery came slowly. The storm had passed, leaving drifts higher than the windows, but Maggie could barely walk across the room without exhaustion claiming her. Chase tended her with infinite patience, cooking simple broths, reading to her from his small collection of books, never straying far from her side. "I'm useless," she fretted one afternoon, watching him struggle with both household chores and ranch work. "You're healing," he corrected. "And you're here. That's all that matters." It was during these quiet days of recovery that the walls between them finally crumbled entirely. With nowhere to go and nothing to prove, they talked with new openness. Chase told her about the sacred places of his people, valleys where eagles nested and springs that never froze. Maggie shared her secret dream of children, the family she'd hoped to build before tragedy and isolation nearly broke her spirit. Could still happen, Chase said quietly one evening. Children who'd belonged to both worlds. The possibility hung between them like morning mist, delicate and full of promise. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they shared the bed, Chase holding her carefully against his chest, Maggie feeling safer than she had since childhood. As her strength returned, so did their connection deepen. The intimacy forged in crisis transformed into something richer. They moved together with new ease, casual touches that spoke of growing comfort, a hand on a shoulder while passing, fingers tangling as they walked to the barn, the way Chase now pulled her against him each night as naturally as breathing. It was nearly February when Maggie felt strong enough to venture outside. The world had been transformed by the blizzard, familiar landmarks buried under sculptured drifts, but the sun shone brilliant on the snow, and the air, while bitter cold, felt clean and new. "Spring will come," Chase said, wrapping a buffalo robe around her shoulders. "Always does, no matter how hard the winter." They were checking on the horses, making sure the lean-to had held against the storm's fury, when Maggie noticed tracks in the snow. fresh tracks, leading from the ridge down toward their valley. Chase saw them too, his body tensing. "Get inside," he said quietly. But Maggie had learned to read sign herself now. "Those aren't horse tracks. Someone came on foot, in the storm or just after." She followed the trail with her eyes. "They watched the house, then left. Could be anyone. Drifter looking for shelter. Maybe." Neither of them believed it. The tracks were too deliberate, the watching spot too carefully chosen. Someone had surveyed their home while they were trapped by the storm, vulnerable and unaware. "The Holloways?" Maggie asked. "Maybe, or someone they sent." Chase studied the horizon, looking for movement. "Storm bought us time, but spring will bring trouble with it." That night, despite the warmth of their bed and the comfort of his arms, Maggie couldn't sleep. The illness had left her feeling fragile, mortal in a way she hadn't before, and now, with danger circling again, she found herself clinging to each peaceful moment like a treasure that might be snatched away. "What are you thinking?" Chase asked, feeling her restlessness. "About time," she said softly. "How little we might have, how much I want to make it count." He pulled her closer, pressing his lips to her hair. "Then we make it count, every day, every hour. The Lakota way teaches that each dawn is a gift, each sunset a completion. We live fully in the time we're given." "Show me," she whispered. "Show me how to live without fear of ending." In answer, he kissed her, not the gentle, careful kisses of recent weeks, but something deeper, hungrier. Maggie responded with equal fervor, pouring all her gratitude, her growing love, her fierce determination into the connection between them. They came together like survivors of shipwreck finding shore, desperate and grateful and utterly present. Afterward, they lay entwined, watching starlight through the frost-etched window. "I love you," Maggie said, the words escaping like birds taking flight. "I didn't think I could again, but I do." Chase was quiet so long she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Then, in my language, we say mitakuya oyasin, all my relations. It means we're connected to everything, everyone. But you, he turned her face to his, you're kanteskuye, the one my heart created for itself. I loved you before I knew you existed. They made plans that night, real plans for a future together. Come spring, they'd add to the cabin, maybe start a small trading post to serve the scattered homesteads. They'd breed horses, combining Chase's knowledge of Indian ponies with Maggie's understanding of Eastern bloodlines. They'd build something lasting, something that belonged to neither world fully but drew strength from both. "Children, too?" Maggie asked hopefully. "Many children," Chase agreed. "Strong ones who carry both our strengths forward." But even as they dreamed, the tracks in the snow reminded them that others had different plans. The world wouldn't easily accept what they were building. Spring would bring green grass and new life, but it would also bring men with guns and hearts full of hate. "Whatever comes," Maggie said, echoing her earlier promise, "we face it together." Chase completed, "No more standing alone." Outside, a wolf howled, long and mournful across the frozen landscape. Once, the sound would have frightened Maggie. Now she heard it differently. Not a threat, but a reminder. Life persisted even in the harshest conditions. Love could bloom in the most unlikely ground. And sometimes, two broken people could create something whole and beautiful, even as storms gathered on every horizon. She turned in Chase's arms, memorizing his face in the dim light. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. But tonight, warm and safe and loved, she was exactly where she belonged. The fever had burned away her last doubts, leaving only certainty. This man, this life, this love, she would fight for it all with everything she had. "Sleep now," Chase murmured, pulling the quilts higher around them. "Tomorrow we start preparing for whatever comes next." Maggie closed her eyes, feeling his heartbeat steady beneath her palm. Yes, tomorrow they would prepare for battle. But tonight, they had won something precious, a love forged in hardship, tested by illness, and strengthened by choice. Whatever storms waited beyond the mountains, They would weather them as they had weathered this one, together. The rider came at dawn on a March morning when the first green shoots were pushing through the melting snow. Maggie saw him first, a lone figure picking his way carefully down the muddy trail. Not one of the Holloways, but a stranger, thin and nervous-looking, clutching a leather satchel like his life depended on it. "Official business," he called out before Chase could level the rifle. "From the territorial office. Need to speak to the woman, Mrs. Donovan." "Mrs. Whitehawk," Chase corrected coldly. "State your business from there." The man, he introduced himself as Cornelius Pratt, territorial clerk, dismounted awkwardly. "There's been accusations made, serious ones, about the death of Thomas Donovan." Maggie felt the world tilt. Beside her, Chase's hand found hers, steady and strong. "Tom died in an accident," she said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "A storm. The barn door." "Yes, well," Pratt fumbled with his satchel. "That's been called into question. His family, his mother in particular, has filed formal charges. Claims you," he cleared his throat, "claims you murdered him for his property." "That's a lie." The words burst from Maggie with unexpected force. "I love Tom. I tried to save him." "Perhaps so. But you'll need to answer these charges before Judge Garrett, trials set for 2 weeks hence." He thrust a document at them. "You're required to appear, or a warrant will be issued." After Pratt left, scurrying away like he feared contamination, Maggie sank onto the porch steps. The paper shook in her hands, formal language that dressed hatred in legal terms. "She never forgave me for marrying him," Maggie said numbly. "Said I wasn't good enough, that I'd trapped him. When he died," she laughed bitterly, "she needed someone to blame. And now, with me married to you, she has the excuse she wanted." Chase knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. "We'll fight this. Together." "With what? You think they'll believe us? An Indian and his white wife against the grieving mother of a respected man?" Tears she'd held back for months finally spilled over. "They've already decided I'm guilty. This trial, it's just for show." "Then we make sure it's a good show." His fierce determination cut through her despair. "We find witnesses, people who knew what Tom was really like, who saw how his mother treated you. The truth still means something, even out here." But as they rode into Bitter Creek 2 weeks later, Maggie's hope dwindled. The town was packed. Word of the trial had spread, drawing spectators from miles around. The looks they received ranged from curious to openly hostile. Someone had painted "murderer" on the wall of the courthouse. The makeshift courtroom was standing room only. Judge Garrett, a stern man with silver sideburns, presided from behind a table at the front. The Donovan family clustered on one side, Tom's mother Elizabeth in dramatic black, supported by Tom's brothers Patrick and Sean. Their lawyer, a slick man from Fort Pierre named Aldrich, smiled at Maggie like a snake eyeing a mouse. Chase had scraped together enough money to hire their own lawyer, Benjamin Morse, young and earnest but clearly out of his depth. As the proceedings began, Maggie felt the weight of every stare, every whisper. Aldrich painted a damning picture. Maggie, the grasping farm girl who'd seduced an innocent man, the hasty marriage, the convenient death just months later, leaving her with property and freedom to pursue her unnatural desires. "And where do we find the supposed widow now?" Aldrich asked, voice dripping contempt. "Living in sin with a savage, flaunting her disregard for Christian morality and the memory of her dead husband." "Objection," Morse said weakly. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitehawk are legally married." To the eternal shame of this territory. Aldrich shot back. The first day was a parade of witnesses for the prosecution. Elizabeth Donovan wept prettily as she described her son's perfect health, his happy nature before the marriage. Patrick testified about arguments he'd allegedly overheard, words twisted to sound like threats. Even neighbors who'd barely known them offered hearsay and speculation. That night, in the room at the boarding house, the hotel had refused them. Maggie felt despair crushing her chest. "They're going to convict me. You know it, I know it. This isn't about justice. Not yet, Chase said grimly. Tomorrow, we tell our side. But their witnesses were few. Old Dr. Morrison testified that Tom's injuries were consistent with accident, but Aldrich made him admit he couldn't rule out foul play. Sarah Muller spoke about Maggie's character, but her German accent and status as an outsider weakened her credibility. The few others who'd promised to speak failed to appear, suddenly discovering urgent business elsewhere. Then Chase took the stand. You weren't there the night Thomas Donovan died, Aldrich said dismissively. What could you possibly know about it? I know Margaret Whitehawk, Chase replied, using her full name with quiet dignity. I know she still cries for him sometimes, even now. I know she keeps his photograph beside our bed, speaks to it when she thinks I'm not watching. Does that sound like a killer to you? It sounds like guilt, Aldrich sneered. And what would an Indian know of Christian conscience anyway? Chase's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. I know enough to recognize love and grief when I see them, and I know enough to see when hatred wears the mask of justice. It was powerful testimony, but Maggie could see it wasn't enough. The jury, 12 men, all white, several known associates of the Holloways, had made up their minds before the trial began. Then, just as Morse was making his closing arguments, the courtroom doors burst open. A woman stood there, travel-stained and breathing hard, middle-aged, with graying hair and a determined set to her jaw. Maggie recognized her with a shock. Ruth Morrison, who'd worked as housekeeper for the Donovans until a month before Tom's death. I need to speak, Ruth announced. I've ridden 3 days to get here, and by God, you'll hear what I have to say? Judge Garrett frowned. This is highly irregular. So is convicting an innocent woman. Ruth shot back. I worked in that house for 2 years. I know what really went on. Aldrich objected, but public curiosity won out. Ruth was sworn in, her words falling into the hushed courtroom like stones into still water. Tom Donovan wasn't the saint his mother makes him out to be. She began. He had a temper, especially when he'd been drinking. Many a night I cleaned up after his rages, broken dishes, furniture. Once, Maggie's arm in a sling she said came from falling off a horse. Elizabeth Donovan surged to her feet. Lies! How dare you! Sit down, Elizabeth! Ruth said sharply. You knew. You always knew. But he was your golden boy, could do no wrong. You made that girl's life miserable. Nothing she did was good enough. And when Tom died, really died, in a stupid accident because he was too proud to wait out a storm, you needed someone to blame besides yourself. She turned to the jury. I left that house because I couldn't stand the hypocrisy anymore. But when I heard about this trial, about what you're trying to do to that girl, I couldn't stay silent. Tom Donovan died because he was a stubborn fool who went out in weather that would kill anyone. Maggie tried to stop him. I know because she told me the next morning, before Elizabeth started filling her head with guilt and lies. The courtroom erupted. Elizabeth shrieked denials. Aldrich demanded Ruth be removed. But other voices rose too, people emboldened by Ruth's courage, sharing whispered stories of Tom's temper, Elizabeth's manipulation. Judge Garrett pounded his gavel repeatedly before order was restored. When the jury returned after barely an hour's deliberation, their verdict was unanimous. Not guilty. Maggie sagged against Chase, tears streaming down her face. But the victory felt hollow as they faced the crowd outside. Legal vindication hadn't changed hearts. If anything, the hatred in some faces had deepened. This isn't over, Marcus Holloway said, pushing close enough for them to hear. You might have fooled that jury, but we know what you are. Both of you. That night, they camped outside town rather than risk staying longer. As they sat by their small fire, Maggie felt wrung out, empty. Ruth Morrison risked everything to speak for me, she said wonderingly. I barely knew her. Sometimes one person's courage lights a spark. Chase replied. She saw injustice and chose to stand against it. That's how change happens, one voice at a time. But Marcus was right. This isn't over. No, Chase agreed. But you're free. We're free. The rest we face as it comes." They returned home to find their ranch untouched. Bobby Muller had been checking on it. He and his grandmother, some of their few true allies. But as spring advanced, the pressure mounted in other ways. Fences cut, water sources fouled, dead animals left as warnings. One evening, as they worked together in the garden, Maggie voiced the fear that haunted her. "Maybe we should leave, start fresh somewhere else." Chase straightened, studying her. "Is that what you want?" She thought about it. Really considered abandoning this land they'd fought so hard to claim. "No," she said finally. "This is our home. We've bled for it, nearly died for it. I won't let them drive us away. Then we stay. We build. We show them that hatred doesn't win." He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "My brave warrior woman." That night, as they lay together, Maggie felt the child quicken in her womb for the first time, the secret she'd been carrying since the trial, waiting for the right moment to share. She took Chase's hand, placed it on her still flat stomach. "What?" he began. Then his eyes widened with understanding. "October, I think," she whispered. "A harvest baby." The joy and fear that crossed his face in quick succession mirrored her own feelings. A child would make them more vulnerable, give their enemies another target, but it also raised the stakes of their fight. This wasn't just about them anymore. "Our child will be born free," Chase said fiercely. "On our land, in our home, I swear it." Maggie believed him. Whatever came next, they would face it as they'd faced everything else, together, with courage, with love that had grown stronger for being tested. The trial had been meant to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something harder, more resilient. She thought of Ruth Morrison's unexpected courage, of the few voices that had risen in support. Not everyone was against them, and perhaps, child by child, generation by generation, the world could change. It had to. For the sake of the life growing inside her, it had to. The night came wrapped in unusual heat for September, the kind that pressed against the skin and made the air feel thick as wool. Maggie couldn't sleep, her swollen belly making every position uncomfortable. 8 months along now. She moved with the careful grace of late pregnancy, one hand always supporting her back. Chase had been restless all day, checking and rechecking their defenses. The harassment had intensified through summer, poisoned water holes, scattered livestock, threats nailed to fence posts. But tonight felt different. Even the horses sensed it, milling nervously in the corral. "Something's coming," Chase said, standing at the window, rifle in hand. Maggie joined him, peering into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing. Then, orange glows on the horizon, moving like fireflies. Torches, many of them. "Get to the root cellar," Chase ordered, already moving to gather ammunition. "No." Maggie's voice was steel. "We talked about this. I won't hide while you fight alone. Maggie, the baby. We'll have 2 parents or none." She awkwardly strapped on the gun belt he'd made for her, the pistol riding high above her belly. "Don't argue. We don't have time." They took positions, Chase at the front window, Maggie at the side, watching the torches grow closer. She could make out riders now, 15 or 20, led by the unmistakable bulk of Jack Holloway. "Chase Whitehawk!" Holloway's voice boomed across the yard. "Last chance. Send out the woman and ride away. No one needs to die tonight." "The only ones dying will be those who threaten my family," Chase called back. "This is your last warning. Holloway, turn around." Harsh laughter rippled through the group. "Family? That abomination she's carrying? We're doing God's work, cleaning up this territory." Maggie's hand went protectively to her belly. Their child, condemned before even drawing breath. The injustice of it sparked fury that burned away her fear. "You speak of God?" she shouted. "While you come like thieves in the night? You're nothing but cowards hiding behind torches and numbers. Shut your mouth, woman!" Marcus Holloway snarled. "You've played Indian wife too long. Time to remember your place. My place is here." Maggie shot back. "And here I stay." The first torch arced through the air, landing on the porch roof. Then another, and another. Chase's rifle cracked, and a man cried out. Maggie fired too, her shots keeping riders from approaching the well where they might draw water to spread the fire. But there were too many, coming from too many directions. Smoke began to fill the cabin as the roof caught. Through the chaos, Maggie heard something that chilled her. Splashing. They were dousing the walls with kerosene. "We have to get out," Chase said urgently. "The barn! We can make a stand there." They moved together, Chase covering their retreat while Maggie struggled across the yard. A rider charged from the darkness. Chase spun, fired, but the man kept coming. His gun rose, pointed at Maggie. She shot him, center mass, just as Chase had taught her. The rider toppled backward, and Maggie felt nothing but grim satisfaction. These men had come to burn her home, kill her child. They'd made their choice. They almost made it to the barn when Maggie stumbled, crying out as pain lanced through her middle. Not from injury, something deeper, primal. The baby. "No," she gasped. "Not now! Please, not now!" Chase half-carried her the last few yards, kicking the barn door shut behind them. Outside, men shouted, regrouping. Inside, Maggie doubled over as another contraction hit. "The stress," she panted. "It's brought on labor. Chase, I can't, not here, not like this." His face was terrible in its controlled fear. "Then we end this, now." He helped her to a corner where hay bales provided cover, then moved with deadly purpose. Through the barn's high window, his rifle spoke again and again. Men scattered, seeking cover, but they didn't retreat. "Burn them out," Holloway roared. "Burn it all." More torches flew. The cabin was fully ablaze now, their home consuming itself in hungry flames. Sparks drifted toward the barn. It would only be a matter of time. Another contraction seized Maggie, stronger than before. She bit down on a scream, tasting blood. Through the pain, she heard something else. Thunder, but the sky had been clear. "Chase!" she gasped. Listen. He heard it too. Hoofbeats, many of them. The attackers heard as well, milling in confusion. Then new gunfire erupted, not aimed at the barn, but at Holloway's men. "What in hell?" someone shouted. Through the barn door, Maggie glimpsed salvation. Riders pouring into the yard, Bobby Mueller, the old Dr. Morrison, even stern Judge Garrett himself, and leading them, of all people, Ruth Morrison with a shotgun across her saddle. "That's enough," the judge roared with surprising authority. "Drop your weapons, all of you. This lynching ends now." "Stay out of this, Garrett," Jack Holloway snarled. "You've got no authority here. I've got 20 armed men who say otherwise." Garrett replied coldly. "And unlike you, we're not afraid to face our neighbors in daylight. Now drop the guns, or we'll drop you." The standoff stretched taut. Then one of Holloway's men threw down his rifle. Another followed. Like dominoes, they fell, until only the Holloways themselves remained armed. "This isn't over," Marcus spat. "Yes," Ruth Morrison said clearly. "It is. You've terrorized this valley long enough. These people," she gestured to Chase and Maggie, "have shown more courage and decency than the lot of you combined. I'm ashamed it took us this long to stand with them." One by one, Holloway's men melted away into the darkness. Jack Holloway himself sat his horse for a long moment, staring at the burning cabin with something like satisfaction. Then he too turned and rode away, his sons trailing behind. As soon as they were gone, "Doctor," Morrison rushed to the barn. He found Maggie deep in labor, Chase supporting her as she struggled through contractions. "How long?" the doctor asked briskly. "An hour, maybe more." Chase answered. "The pains are coming fast. Then we'd best get to work. Ruth, bring water and clean cloths." "You men," he glared at the others crowding the barn door. "Make yourselves useful. We need light, and that fire needs controlling before it spreads." What followed was a strange mixture of birth and firefighting. While men formed bucket brigades to save what they could, Maggie labored to bring new life into a world still smoldering with hate. Chase never left her side. his steady presence anchoring her through the pain. "I can see the head. Doctor," Morrison announced. "One more push. Maggie, you're almost there." She bore down with everything she'd left, a scream tearing from her throat. Then, a different cry, thin, indignant, perfect. "A girl," the doctor said, placing the squalling infant on Maggie's chest. "Small but fierce, like her mother." Maggie looked down at her daughter through tears, dark hair like Chase's, but her nose, her chin, a perfect blend of two worlds, born in violence but welcomed with love. "What will you call her?" Ruth asked softly. Maggie looked at Chase, saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. "Hope," she said. "Hope, Sarah Whitehawk, for what she represents, for what protected her tonight." As dawn broke, the full extent of the damage became clear. The cabin was gone, reduced to smoking ruins, but the barn stood, and the corrals, and most importantly, the 3 lives sheltered within. Judge Garrett approached as Chase emerged to survey the damage. "I owe you both an apology," he said gruffly. "I knew what the Holloways were planning. We all did. Took Mrs. Morrison here shaming us into action before we found our courage." "Better late than never," Chase said quietly. "The territorial governor will hear about this." Garrett continued. "Attempted murder, arson. The Holloways won't terrorize this valley anymore. I'll see to that personally." Throughout the morning, neighbors arrived. Some who'd stood silent before now brought food, blankets, offers of help. The Mullers offered their spare room until the cabin could be rebuilt. Others pledged labor and materials. "Funny how a baby changes things," Ruth observed. "Watching Hope sleep in her mother's arms makes people remember what matters." But not everyone had changed. As the crowd thinned, a few lingered at the edges, faces hard with resentment. The battle was won. But Maggie knew the war wasn't over. It might never be. Not in their lifetimes. "Regrets?" Chase asked that evening as they sheltered in the Muller's house. Hope nursing contentedly. Maggie considered the question, thinking of all they'd lost, all they'd endured. Then she looked at her daughter, their daughter, and felt peace settle into her bones. "None," she said firmly. "We stood our ground. We protected what matters. And we showed them that love is stronger than hate, even if we have to prove it again and again." Chase kissed her forehead, then bent to kiss Hope's downy head. "My warriors," he murmured. "My fierce, brave warriors." Outside, the rain that had threatened all summer finally came, washing away the ash and blood, preparing the ground for new growth. It fell on the ruins of their cabin, on the scorched earth where violence had bloomed. But it also fell on the green valleys beyond, where horses grazed and eagles soared, where 2 worlds might yet learn to live as one. The storm had passed, leaving scars but not defeat, and in a borrowed room, a child born of 2 peoples slept peacefully, protected by parents who'd fought the darkness and won, not a final victory, but enough for now. Enough to build on, enough for hope. Spring came early that year, painting the prairie in shades of green and gold that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness they'd endured. 6 months had passed since the fire. 6 months since Hope's dramatic arrival into a world of flame and fury. The new cabin stood proud on the old foundation, larger and stronger than before, built by neighbors who'd finally found their conscience. Maggie stood on the porch, Hope balanced on her hip, watching Chase work with a young colt in the corral. The baby gurgled happily, reaching chubby fingers toward her father. At 6 months, Hope was a perfect blend of her parents, Chase's dark hair and high cheekbones, Maggie's green eyes and determined chin. "Your daddy's going to teach you to ride before you can properly walk," Maggie murmured to her daughter, "just like a proper Lakota child." The sound of approaching horses made her tense, old fears dying hard. But it was only Bobby Mueller, accompanied by Judge Garrett. Both men had become regular visitors, the judge particularly taken with Hope. "Morning, Mrs. Whitehawk," Garrett called, dismounting with a grunt. "That little one growing like a weed?" "Like the prairie grass after rain," Maggie agreed. shifting Hope to her other hip. "What brings you out this way?" The judge's expression grew serious. "News from Fort Pierre. The Holloways have been formally charged. Trials set for next month. We'll need you both to testify." Maggie felt the familiar knot of dread, but also relief. They haven't been seen since that night. Been hiding out in the territories, Bobby added. But the law finally caught up. Marcus killed a man in a bar fight. That brought the authorities sniffing around, found out about what happened here. Chase joined them, having seen the visitors. "Will it stick?" he asked bluntly. "Or will they buy their way free?" "Not this time," Garrett said firmly. "Too many witnesses, too much evidence. The territorial governor wants to make an example. Times are changing, slowly but surely." After they left, Chase and Maggie walked together through their property, Hope sleeping against her father's chest in the cradleboard he'd made. The garden was already showing green shoots, the horses growing sleek on spring grass. "Think it's really over?" Maggie asked. "The Holloways? Maybe." Chase adjusted Hope's weight gently. "But there will be others. There always are. Then we'll face them," Maggie said simply, "like we always do." They reached the small grove where they'd planted a tree for Hope's birth, a sapling oak that would grow strong and tall. Nearby, Storm Dancer grazed with her new foal, the wounds from the barbed wire incident now just faint scars. "I've been thinking," Chase said slowly, "about what Judge Garrett said. Time's changing. Maybe we could be part of that change." "What do you mean?" "A trading post, like we talked about. But more than that. A place where both peoples could come, trade, learn from each other, show them it can work." He gestured between them. "That this can work." Maggie considered it. They'd already proven many things. That love could bridge two worlds. That courage came in many forms. That standing together made them stronger than standing alone. Why not prove more? "The White Hawk Trading Company," she said, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." Chase smiled, the expression still rare enough to make her heart skip. "Equal partners. In everything," she agreed. Hope stirred, opening green eyes that seemed to see straight through to the soul. She reached up, touching both parents' faces with perfect trust. This child would grow up belonging fully to both worlds, carrying forward the best of each. "Mama," Hope babbled, her first real word. Then, turning to Chase, "Dada." Both parents froze, then laughed with pure joy. Their daughter, speaking the universal language of love, recognizing no boundaries between peoples. As the sun climbed higher, warming the earth and awakening the land from winter's grip, the White Hawk family stood together in their small grove. The oak sapling reached toward the light, its leaves unfurling like tiny hands. Storm Dancer's foal pranced on new legs, testing its strength. Life persisted, renewed itself, grew stronger. "Whatever comes next," Maggie said, watching an eagle circle overhead. "We'll be ready." Chase wrapped his free arm around her, pulling his family close. "Together," he agreed. The eagle cried out, wild and free, before turning west toward the mountains. Below, on the prairie that had seen so much pain and triumph, three hearts beat as one. The future stretched before them. Uncertain, but no longer fearsome. They had survived the worst storms, faced down hatred with love, created life from ashes. Now it was time to build something lasting, a legacy for Hope and the children who would follow. A bridge between worlds that others said could never meet. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of possibilities, of spring and new beginnings, of love that refused to bow before prejudice. The Lakota rider who had chosen the woman no one would touch, the widow who had found courage in the depths of despair. Together, they'd written a story of redemption on the canvas of the frontier, proving that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquest, but from the simple act of standing firm, loving deeply, and refusing to let darkness win. As they walked back toward their cabin, Hope babbling happily between them, the sun painted their shadows long across the land. Three figures merged into one, heading home. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love and courage in the Old West. If you're enjoying these tales of the American frontier, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories that bring history to life. And let me know your thoughts on Chase and Maggie's journey. Did their love story touch your heart? What part moved you the most? Your comments mean the world to us.